The resurrection of the dead is the most important Christian belief. Well, hello everyone. Today I'm going to look at an exam question that was asked in November 2020, which was the one that you just heard there in the introduction about the resurrection of the dead and whether that's the most important Christian belief. Now, obviously, Christianity is full of beliefs. I mean, it's very much a belief-driven religion. And I'd like to try to get you to think of three Bible passages which I think are really helpful when unpacking this particular question. As always, they're always quite ambiguous and can be interpreted in different ways. So you've got to make the judgment about which you think is the most useful. I'm going to start with the writer St. Paul, who's a really important writer and sets out much of Christian beliefs. In fact, there's plenty that would say, well, it's not really Christianity, it's more Paulinanity and in his views. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he speaks about the resurrection of the dead. And in it, he talks about it as a Christian belief. And he says, now, if Christ is preached as raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? For if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. In other words, it's the most important Christian belief, because if there is no resurrection from the dead, then Jesus hasn't been raised from the dead. And if Jesus hasn't been raised from the dead, then everything that Christians believe is in vain. Now, one of the most famous passages, and one that's often inscribed on students' minds, as well as those of church-going Christians, of course, is John chapter 3, verse 16. And in John chapter 3, verse 16, it says, God so loved the world that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Now, eternal life sounds like the resurrection of the dead, doesn't it? It sounds like life after death. It sounds like that's what it's trying to get you to think of. So let me say that again. John chapter 3, verse 16, whoever believes in Jesus will not perish but have eternal life. So again, that suggests it's the most important Christian belief, the belief that there is life after death. However, now of course, any exam answer requires a however, and the however here is an interesting one, because we turn to one that actually could be interpreted either way, and that's an important thing that you can interpret and make sense of that. In the end of Matthew's Gospel, in fact in the end of Matthew, Mark and Luke's Gospel, there's something called the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus expounds on the end of the world and what the end of the world will be like. And during the course of this in Matthew's Gospel, he gives a story that's come to be known as the parable of the sheep and the goats. Now, this is in Matthew chapter 25 and is really worth trying to remember and use and effectively explain as well as you can interpret it. So if you look at Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the sheep and the goat, then Jesus is indeed talking about the day of judgment. Lest we forget it, when the dead are raised and judged, which is a fundamental Christian belief, which is in the creed. That's something that's worth noting. It is said out, we believe in the resurrection of the dead. And yet, when Jesus talks about this day of judgment, that doesn't seem to be the most important thing he's talking about, because what he's talking about is how you inherit the judgment. Come, he says, O blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. 4, and then there follows a famous list, which is often well known and should be inscribed on every student's mind. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger. You welcomed me. I was naked. You clothed me. I was sick. You visited me. I was in prison. You came to me. And anyone that does a moral issues paper or expounds anything along those lines, that's such a useful and important list. Oh, hang on a minute. This is probably the only occasion, in fact I know it is the only occasion in which Jesus speaks of eternal rewards and eternal punishments. And hey, guess what? The most important belief here seems to be not that you get resurrection from the dead, but that you morally care for those in need. And so that's the challenge. What's more important? The reward, the eternal reward, the rising from the dead, which is set out in the Creed, which is set out in 1 Corinthians 15, which is set out in John chapter 3, which is set out here in Matthew chapter 25, or the actions you do while here on earth. Does Jesus in fact want you to be someone who believes you should love your neighbour, care for people? And the two probably fundamentally most important teachings that you'll ever come across are love of neighbour and treating others as you'd like to be treated. That's called the golden rule. I hope you found that helpful. Thanks ever so much for watching. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, keep tuning in, take care.